Hi friends, Tommy Wave here with something a little bit different today. Since the Witchwood spoilers started and I finished my budget deck series videos for Kobolds and Catacombs a couple of weeks ago, I've had a lot of people ask me for my opinions on some of the new Witchwood cards. So what I thought I'd do is actually go through some of the commons and rares for the new set and just give my thoughts on a couple of those cards, and particularly some that might make it into some budget decks. So what we're going to be looking at is mostly, I guess, aggressive cards, because a lot of the budget decks that we make are particularly aggressive, and also some of the build around me rares that might end up being highlights of those decks. So without further ado, let's get started. The first card I've got here is the Cauldron Elemental. So it's an 8 mana 7/7. Your other elementals have +2 attack. One of the great things about elementals as an archetype is that it does lend itself quite well to budget decks. Not a lot of them are rotating out, and a lot of the core cards are common or rare. So Cauldron Elemental presents itself as a great finisher for a lot of those decks. They are quite good at going wide. So this could be something that you're dropping on turn 8 to kill your opponent with a bunch of smaller attackers. It is by itself not a good rate, and also we don't like to include too many 8 drops in a lot of our aggressive decks, but it does present itself as an interesting option for some of those lists. The next card we've got is the Swamp Leech. So I'm just going to go through all the neutral cards first, and then we'll go into the class cards. So Swamp Leech is a 1 mana 2/1 with lifesteal, and it is a beast. Hunter does lose Fiery Bat, so this just presents itself as an option, a deck that wants aggressive 1-drop beasts, though this one will be competing with Raptor Hatchling. The next card that I've got here is Tanglefur Mystic. This is actually one of my favourite cards, particularly for budget deck building of the new set. It's a 3 mana 3/4, which is quite a good body for a 3-drop. And on Battlecry, it adds a random 2-cost minion to each player's hand. So the important thing here, it's very similar to a card like Spellslinger, which is a card that saw a fair bit of constructed play. The key thing here is it's a good body that's going to give us gas, and also potentially give us a bit more granularity within our next couple of turns, as we could have already deployed the 2-drop in our hand. So this gives us another one that we can potentially play on turn, say 5, with another 3-drop, or even on turn 5 we can play this and our 2-drop. A 3/4 body also generally trades quite well into another 2-drop. So an interesting one there. I'm very keen to see how well it does. Also keen to see how many times we give our opponent or ourselves a Doomsayer. Up next, this is a bit of a loose one. It's Marsh Drake. So it's a 3 mana 5/4, huge stats. It's also a dragon, which is generally a positive thing. But on Battlecry, it summons a 2/1 poisonous Drake Slayer for our opponent. So the reason I say that this is pretty loose is because on its own you're going to play this and your opponent's just going to trade their 2/1 poisonous dude into it. So you're going to have spent 3 mana for absolutely nothing. 3 mana to discard a card, which may be worse than Treachery. However, it does have quite a high potential if you have minions on board, or for instance if you're a warrior and you have a weapon, you can immediately clear out the 2/1, and then you've got quite a big threat on board. It also combines quite well with cards like Argent Squire and Righteous Protector, which generally stay on board, and also trade into the Drake Slayer quite well. If they still have their Divine Shield, you don't even lose your minion. And it also enables some dragon synergies, so it's always something to keep in mind, because there are within this set a couple new dragon synergy cards, and it could potentially turn those on. So definitely a benefit there. Not one I'm super confident on, but something to keep in mind if there is a deck that does have quite a few resources that it can trade in the early game. This is also a terrible top deck, just to keep that in mind. Up next, for the neutral cards, we have Ravencaller. another card that I'm really excited by. It has a lot of similarities with our Tanglefur Mystic. So it's a 3 mana 2/1 that on Battlecry adds 2 random 1-cost minions to our hand. So this is another card that's going to re-gas us, fill us back up, and the thing to keep in mind is generally 1-drops are pretty awesome. They have quite a lot of stats, generally 2/1s for 1, which is pretty good. I mean, this guy's 2/1 for 3. And there are some really good hits that we can get. A lot of the Warlock 1-costs, a lot of like Glacial Shard, Firefly, these types of things. And having more 1-drops is great for our decks that want to go wide. So in particular, we think of Token Druid, things like that, where we want to have a critical mass of minions on the board in order to kill our opponent with things like Savage Roar. So the last neutral card that I've got is Scaleworm. So this is a rare, so I'm not super thrilled by it at that rarity, but it is a great board control piece, and it curves really well into Cobalt Scalebane, which Cobalt Scalebane consistently proved itself to be like a budget all-star. It was in most of the decks that we played. And playing this on turn 4, trading into your opponent's 3 or 4 drop. Hopefully the Scaleworm stays alive. Next turn we can drop a Scalebane, and hopefully that's the end of our curve, and we've been able to maintain board pressure that whole time. So it's an interesting one. It is a beast, so it's got some potential beast synergies going on there, but we'll see if some of the dragon decks are possible to do on a budget. Alright, moving on from the neutral cards, we go into Druid. The first card we have here, the only Druid card that really jumped out at me, is Forest Guide. So it's a 4 mana 1/6. It says at the end of your turn, both players draw a card. This has been a much talked about card within the set. I guess my take on it from a more budget perspective, obviously the stats aren't great for an aggressive deck. However, we've definitely seen cards like Jeeves and Cult Master see play in Token Druid before as a way to draw cards to keep the aggressive deck in the game. Obviously, this is probably less powerful than both of those cards, and Cult Master is still around as is in Classic. However, it is just another option for us to draw cards, to make sure that we are hitting all our minions, make sure we're hitting our Savage Roars to try and kill our opponent. Just an interesting one to highlight there. Moving on, Hunter cards. We have the Hunting Mastiff. It's a 2 mana 2/1 beast with Echo and Rush. So this is the first Echo card that we've seen. If you haven't looked at the spoilers before, when you play an Echo card, essentially you get a copy of it in your hand, and you can just keep playing copies of that card that turn, as long as you have the mana to play them, and at the end of the turn it just disappears. So for 2 mana we can have a 2/1 with Rush. For 4 mana we can have 2 2/1s with Rush. 6 mana, 3 of them, so on. So the Hunting Mastiff is not necessarily an excellent 2-drop. In fact, this is the theme of Echo cards. For their mana cost, they're not exactly the greatest stats. However, they have the flexibility in the late game. You can play multiples, and even then they're still not great for the mana cost. But it's that flexibility of having a 2-drop or a 4-drop or a 6-drop. So I don't think we'd be leaning too hard on always wanting to have our Mastiff on 2, but in a pinch, we're happy to play it on 2. I think what really intrigues me is once you get to 4 and 6 mana with these, where you're potentially playing 2 or 3, using 1 to like trade into another minion, and then playing the others just have board presence. It does combo well with Direwolf Alpha, which is a card that we've played in I think that was the one card that we played in every single budget deck, except for Priest. So something to keep in mind. We'll move on to the next Hunter card, which is, once again, maybe a bit of a loose one, but a card that I'm really interested in. It's Dire Frenzy. 4 mana spell, gives a beast +3/+3, then shuffles 3 copies of it into your deck that also have +3/+3. So it's a little bit clunky, requires us to have board presence, which we are Hunter, so it is not the most outrageous thing for us to have board presence, but requires us to also have specifically a beast. However, it combos really well with rush and charge minions, particularly Stone Tusk Ball, because we can play it on turn 5 to hit for 4, and also shuffling a 1 mana 4/4 with charge into our deck is actually pretty sick. It gives us some interesting late game draws. Also goes quite well with the Hunting Mastiff or even Huffer, if we get a Huffer off of a Animal Companion. Just big, not big, but just immediate threats, immediate action on board. And if we play it on our lower drop creatures, it means when we do draw them, for instance, we play this on a Diamol, later on in the game when we do draw that Diamol, it's a 1 mana 4/6, which is a really efficient stat play, which is something we might be interested in. It's also quite cool that we can, if we do play this on 1-drops, we might be able to get some synergy with a card like Tolvir Warden, where we can then draw those 1-drops, and if they're Stone Tusk Balls, throw them out. Alright, next we'll move on to Mage. The main card that I wanted to highlight from Mage is Vexcrow. 4 mana 3/3 is a beast, and it says whenever we cast a spell, summon a random 2-cost minion. So we really want to be able to play 1 or 2 spells with this on board. Otherwise it's just a really terribly statted minion. But it is a minion that needs to be answered, otherwise it will snowball quite quickly and generate quite a lot of value. It obviously works best with cheaper spells or coins, things like that. Unfortunately right now, Mage doesn't exactly have a massive dearth of very cheap spells, but I will say that this works very well with Mirror Image. So on turn 4 with the coin, we can play this coin Mirror Image, generate 2 2-drop minions, create 2 0/2 taunts, which makes it very hard for our opponent to trade into the Vexcrow. Or even just on turn 5 playing this Mirror Image, it's kind of cool, but how many times do we want to be putting Mirror Image in our aggressive decks? We need to weigh those things up, but Vexcrow does seem pretty cool, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of fun once again summoning Doomsayers and killing ourselves. So let's move on to the next class, which is Paladin. We have the Silver Sword. It's an 8 mana weapon. It has 3 attack, 4 durability. It says whenever our hero attacks, give our minions +1/+1. So this is a really expensive card, which once again, like we said with the Cinder Elemental, we generally don't want to play too many of, or any of, in a lot of our aggressive decks. But weapons like these give us a fair bit of reach. If we attack 4 times, that's 12 damage. But it also can potentially help us make our cheaper minions a bit more relevant in the late game. If we start, if it's getting really grindy, all of a sudden our Argent Squires or our hero-powered minions are 2/2s, which is a lot more relevant than 1/1s. If we ever get to play this whilst we have board presence, it's going to be pretty crushing for our opponent. And this is also an interesting budget alternative to a card like Vine Cleaver, which I believe is an epic, and it makes it quite tough, especially if you want to craft Call to Arms as well. Alright, up next we have Bellringer Sentry. So speaking of Call to Arms, this could be an interesting addition to budget Paladin decks instead of Call to Arms. So it's a 4 mana 3/4. Has Battle Cry and Death Rattle to put a secret from your deck onto the battlefield. So some Paladin secrets that will still be in Standard are Get Down, Repentance, and the one that brings back a minion with 1 health, and the one that reduces a minion that your opponent plays to 1 health. So mostly we're looking at, I can't even remember the names of any of these paladin secrets. So mostly Get Down and the one that resurrects a minion are the ones we'd be looking at. Obviously, putting those secrets in our deck does come with a cost in that they have very low impact, and particularly for an aggressive deck, they're not exactly the greatest options. However, getting them for free off of this guy and making it a little bit tougher for our opponent to play around, thinning out our deck so that we're going to hopefully draw more of our high impact cards by the time we get to turn 4, 5, 6. Like I said, not super confident on this one, but yeah, really keen to try it out. Alright, moving on from there, we have Rebuke. Some much talked about card from latest expansion. It's a 2-mana paladin spell that says enemy spells cost 5 more next turn. So the Lotheb effect, for those of you who were around during Naxxramas. And Lotheb was a really powerful card. Rebuke, I think, is less powerful, significantly so. It definitely, we are playing a lot of aggressive decks, so this is going to help us against a lot of the spell-based sweepers. So public enemies being Defile, Hellfire, Dragon's Fury, Blizzard makes those cards next to uncastable the turn after you play this. However, it comes at a significant cost of this card being pretty terrible in aggressive mirrors and against certain strategies. So I think this fits a really good spot as a flex card with a lot of the budget decks that we made. We did have like a section, usually 3 to 4 cards that were flex cards where we could put weapon removal or cards that were good in specific matchups, crabs, what else? Dragon Slayers, a lot of silence effects. This fits pretty well into that category where if we are seeing heaps of Warlock, heaps of Mage that are going to be killing all our minions, chuck a Rebuke or 2 in there and hopefully that should shore that matchup up and make laddering a little bit easier. Alright, on from there we moved to Priest. This is a really cool card, Quartz Elemental. It's a 5-mana 5/8, massive stats. It's an elemental, so a couple of synergies there. Elemental not a downside at the moment. However, it says that this Quartz Elemental can't attack while damaged, which is pretty bad. It's really bad against decks that can easily put out 3 damage. If they're only putting out 1 damage, for instance, Mage, then we're essentially trading off the Mage pinging versus you healing with your hero power. And anytime they're trading minions into this, their minions are probably dying, so we're probably happy with that. But any deck that can output like 3 or more damage quite easily and make it tough for us to heal this back to full is going to be where we struggle. Where I think it's suited, or the decks that it could potentially go into are silence-based priests, where we can just get rid of the disadvantage, or with cards like Defender of Argus. And we've seen both of those kinds of cards played with Humongous Razorleaf before. And I think if we compare this card to Humongous Razorleaf, for an extra 1 mana we get 1 more attack, but also the elemental on its own can actually bash, which is really important if we start top decking, or if we get disrupted in some kind of way. It has really high health, so it could potentially go in our an Inner Fire combo deck. I just wanted to keep an eye on. I think it might be a bit of a sleeper card. Up next, Squashling. It's 2 mana 2/1. It's common. It has Echo, and on Battlecry it restores 2 health. So once again, it has Echo, so we do have that flexibility of playing it on 2 as a really average 2-drop. There's like the Voodoo healer guy that's a 1-drop that does the same thing. We can play it on 4 or 6. Good card if we can force a situation where a lot of trading's going on, potentially with stuff like Tar Creeper, things like that. We can heal that Tar Creeper back up whilst also producing threats on the board as opposed to just using our hero power. Priest is already including quite a lot of high toughness cards in order to take advantage of that, so it naturally can kind of fit in there. Keen to see this card in combination with Orchanized Soul Priest, as we can turn this into a pretty huge burst play, start removing our opponent's minions. We'll move on from there. We go to Rogue, and this is a really cool build around me card at rare. It's a Mist Wraith, 4 mana 3/5. It says whenever we play an Echo card, it gets +1/+1. So 3/5 for 4 mana is not a great rate, but it might be one of these must answer cards. Because if they don't do anything about it and it does come back to our turn, we play 2 Echo cards, all of a sudden we've got a 5/7. Next turn if we play 2 or 3 more, this gets out of hand pretty quickly. The other great thing is it's a card that gets bigger whilst we're progressing our board. For those Magic players out there, it's kind of the reason that Tarmogoyf is such a powerful card, because it's a card that gets bigger just from us playing the game of Magic the Gathering. I'm really keen to try this one, and Rogue is a budget deck that we struggled with. Next card, which is Cheap Shot, which is a spell with Echo. It's a 2 cost and says deal 2 damage to a minion. So the combination of Cheap Shot and the other Echo minions, the neutral ones plus the Rogue ones, means that we have options to both deal with threats on the board and progress our own board with a Mist Wraith in play, which is a huge amount of flexibility. But Cheap Shot just on its own, 2 mana to deal 2 damage, is completely reasonable. Having the flexibility to do 2/2 or 2/2/2 is amazing. And if we can do that with a Mist Wraith on board, it is sick. So really looking forward to this one. Moving on, we have Blink Fox. So it's a 3 mana 3/3, so perfectly reasonable stats. And on Battlecry, adds a random card to our hand from our opponent's class. One of the things we did find with a lot of these budget decks is any card that is random cards can potentially give us cards that we are significantly more powerful than the ones we have access to. It can give us legendaries and things like that. So it'll allow us to potentially high roll our way to victory, which is really good. And getting that on a card with totally reasonable stats, I mean, Undercity Huckster saw plenty of play, and that was a 2 mana 2/2, which was fine. Alright. Up next, we move to Shaman. We have another kind of interesting build around me card in Earthen Might. 2 mana spell, gives a minion +2/+2, and if it's an elemental, adds a random elemental to our hand. So I already mentioned that Firefly, Glacial Shard are 2 of the best 1-drops in the game right now, and this makes a fantastic follow-up to those players, giving them +2/+2, adding an elemental to our hand. And the majority of elementals are, if they're not good, they're usually pretty big, and sometimes that's exactly what we want, is just a big dork to slam down once we've run out of gas, and hopefully get the job done. I'm looking at you, Glacial Crusher, the one that freezes itself. We'll go to the next one. It's a common. It's a 1 mana 0/1 with Taunt. Witch's Apprentice. Battlecry adds a random Shaman spell to our hand. So I talked about this on stream a while ago. On Twitter, I saw APX Void, another phenomenal streamer, was talking about playing Babbling Book in Tempo Mage. And they mentioned that Babbling Book was not a card that in that deck you want to play on turn 1. You'd rather be playing Cabal Lackeys or Mana Worms. Instead, Babbling Book was a card you play kind of in that mid-game as a little bit of granularity. As you know, on turn 4 you can play a 3-drop and the Babbling Book. And potentially gives you a bit more reach, a bit more gas. So I think that's where this, where Witch's Apprentice comes in. Playing it kind of, turn 3, 4, 5. It helps protect some of your key aggro pieces, so Knife Jugglers, Vicious Fledglings, Flame Tongue Totems. And within Shaman spells, there's a massive variety. Obviously, there are some real stinkers. But having your opponent potentially try and play around like lightning storms, volcanoes, but also hexes and also minion buffs really makes it quite tough for them. Hopefully it makes it tough for them. So I'm really keen to see how it plays, because we could be totally wrong. But yeah, just thought I'd throw that Babbling Book comparison out there, because I think it's a pretty accurate one. Up next, Zap, with an exclamation mark. 0 mana spell, deals 2 damage to a minion, and has Overload 1. 0 mana is a really key part of this card, as it's going to let us remove a small minion, and also progress our board. So if we're up against another aggressive deck, they've got a turn 2 Knife Juggler. On our turn 2, we can zap and play our own Knife Juggler. Alright. Up next, we have Fiendish Circle. Very similar to Summon the Finishers. It's a 4 mana Warlock spell. It says summon 4 1/1 imps. So this is really good with Knife Juggler and Direwolf, which, as we've said before, have been kind of mainstays of a lot of our aggro decks. 4/4 worth of stats for 4 that has some synergies with existing cards is where you want to be. Next we have Duskbat. Now this is a sick card. It's a 3 mana 2/4. And on Battlecry, says if our hero took damage this turn, summon 2 1/1 bats. Now, our hero taking damage is kind of a bit of a theme of Warlock within Witchwood, but if we can ever activate this card with something like Flame Imp or Kobold Librarian, even Vulgar Homunculus, which are all cards that aggro Warlock has played before, we get 4/6 worth of stats spread across 3 bodies, which is generally a plus for cards that we're going to include in our deck, and generally a disadvantage if our opponent's playing board sweepers. But worst case scenario, I mean, playing this for 3, playing this on turn 3 isn't great, but even just playing this on turn 5 after we hero power is a totally reasonable thing. Yeah, I think this is going to go straight into a lot of those aggressive Zoo Warlock strategies, and it's going to do quite well. Moving on to the final class, which I think has received the biggest buff in terms of commons and rares in Witchwood, and that is Warrior. So the majority of Warrior cards at common and rare have Rush minions, which are all welcome additions to aggressive decks that are trying to compete on board, control the board. But I wanted to highlight Festerroot Hulk as a great threat that might actually give Warrior the critical mass of threats that it needs to be a really good and viable aggressive deck. So it's a 5 mana 2/7. It says after a friendly minion attacks, gain +1 attack. So another one of these cards where if your opponent does nothing about it, could potentially snowball out of control. And they really either have to answer this or answer every other minion that you play for the rest of the game, which is something they can definitely do. Certain decks can definitely do. But this combined with cards like Frothing Berserker and Vicious Fledgling might be that, like I said, critical mass of cards where your opponent simply can't have enough answers for them, and one of them will run away with the game. 2/7 as well makes it quite resilient to board clears. A card that I'm keen to play with in these aggressive decks, particularly maybe in Spellstone Warrior, which we had quite a lot of fun with in the budget deck series. Last card here is Woodcutter's Axe. It's a 2 mana, 2 attack, 2 durability weapon. It says Death Rattle, give +2/+1 to a random friendly rush minion. So 2 mana weapons, 2 mana 2/2 weapons have been totally reasonable in the past. Cards like Jade Claws come to mind. And I think the key here with the Death Rattle of this weapon is if it does go onto a rush minion, maybe even one that we've played that turn, it can immediately impact the board. So we could be playing this on 2, hitting a minion. Next turn we play our 3 mana 3/3 rush minion and attack Woodcutter's Axe into something. All of a sudden that's a 5/4 that we can use to trade in somewhere else. So obviously your opponent has to have quite a lot of minions for all that trading to go on. But even just landing this onto a minion that's not attacking that turn is totally reasonable. Right, that is it for my Witchwood budget card highlight. Let me know what you think about it in the comments section. Is there any cards that I missed, or any cards that I mentioned that you think are complete stinkers? Let me know. But I think regardless of what you have to think, I'm gonna give them a shot. And until the next video, I'll see you soon. Bye.